Oh, can I filibuster?
I'll just speak to that just quickly, just to talk about the study, the aspects of it, Mr. Angus, and I'll pass it on to the clerk. Just about our calendar is very packed, what we're able to pull off. So, again, the analysts who are wondering, okay, how far do we go with this? Do we report back with a report? Do we? So, Mr. Clerk, go ahead.
I can send around a calendar after tonight's meeting. It's just basically finding the priorities for the committee for, do you want to report on the privacy of digital government services as well as this new study that you're embarking on? Just I'll send around a calendar. It'll make it clear what we can fit in or not.
Okay. Okay. Well, just any debate or?
For me, I'm very interested in following up on some of the discussions we've had in terms of the effect of how the algorithms in certain platforms are being used to distort public conversation, political discourse by moving people towards more and more extremist and false content as opposed to being able to find accurate, credible sources. And I think that some of those algorithms, particularly YouTube, we have not really looked at. We put a lot of attention into Facebook, but these algorithms are having a very distinct impact on civil discourse. It's worth knowing how they work, and of course the larger issues that we've talked about of AI and algorithms. I leave it to my colleagues around the table if they feel that other witnesses should be drawn, but I think we've got a pretty good list of witnesses and not much time, so I'd say let's get down to it.
Yep. I have Mr. Kent.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the topic is worthy of a full study, and I think we're going to be talking about elements of that today in testimony from our witnesses, and I think we should get to that. But given that we've got barely 6 weeks of meaningful committee time left, I'm not sure that we could formally get a study in itself going. Certainly, if there are any windows as we go through discussion of the draft report on digital government or the elements, the outline, the skeleton of a draft report on digital government. If there are opportunities, then certainly the more testimony we can hear, the better off the next Parliament will be to really take it on seriously and chew on it.
Mr. Erskine-Smith.
I'll just say very briefly, I think obviously on May 28th we have a much larger committee hearing with international colleagues coming from other countries, and part of that conversation is going to be about algorithmic accountability and transparency. And so I view these meetings, whether it leads into a more fulsome report in any way, we might run out of time, that's fine. I agree with Mr. Kent that regardless, it's worthwhile for us to hear the evidence, but I think more than anything for us now, it's worthwhile leading into May 28th to listen to some of the experts and might have some more pointed questions.
Okay, sounds good. Everybody, any further discussion on that? Mr. Angus?
Well, I'm a firm believer of having reports so we can show what our committees have done, but I recognize the clock is ticking, so I'm willing to bend on that, but I agree with Mr. Erskine-Smith. This is about setting us up for the International Grant Committee so that we are fully prepared, that we've had a chance to look at some other issues that we may bring to the table. So this, to me, is a good training session leading up. And then out of that committee, there may be an international statement, or we may feel the need to follow up with a further report, but I will take that after we have the international committee and find out what our colleagues around the world think.
Okay, so any more debate, any discussion? No, I see none. All in favor of the motion? All opposed? Carried unanimously. So, okay, thank you, Mr. Angus. We'll get on to business. We have two witnesses here with us today. We have Mr. Ben Wagner, Assistant Professor, Vienna University of Economics, by teleconference. And we also have from Mila, Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, Yoshua Bengio. Hopefully I'm saying that right, or is it Bengio? And we just don't have any volume there.
Yes, Joshua Bengio.
Bengio. Thank you, Mr. Bengio, or Dr. Bengio. Scientific Director via teleconference from Montreal. So we'll start off, first of all, with Mr. Wagner. Go ahead. 10 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
We're good.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. I really appreciate the Standing Committee dealing with these issues. My name is Ben Wagner, and I'm with the Privacy and Sustainable Computing Lab in Vienna. We've been working closely on these issues for some time, specifically trying to understand how to safeguard human rights in a world where artificial intelligence and algorithms are becoming extremely common. And this has included helping prepare Global Affairs Canada for the G7 last year. And it was a great pleasure there working with colleagues like Tara Denham, Jennifer Jepsen, or Marketa Geislerova. And the results that were produced in that, I think, are quite relevant also for this committee. So you have the Charlevoix Common Vision for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. And related to that last year, we were also working on, this is now in a Council of Europe context, a study on the human rights dimensions of algorithms, which I also think would be extremely helpful, especially if you're discussing studies and common challenges faced. Many of the common challenges you're discussing are already in these G7 documents and also in the statements developed for the Council of Europe. So to come back to sort of a more general understanding of why this is important, it's frequently thought of as some unusual new thing that we have artificial intelligence or AI as something sort of new and unusual. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not a new and unusual technology. Artificial intelligence is here right now and is present in many existing applications that are being used. It's increasingly permeating life worlds, and it will soon be difficult to live in the modern world without having AI touching your life on a very daily basis. This deep embedding in societies, of course, poses considerable challenges, but also opportunities. And I think that when we specifically look at the ethical and regulatory dimensions, like I believe this committee is doing, it's extremely important to remember that we're ensuring to try to make sure that all citizens have access to the opportunities of these technologies, and that the opportunities provided by these technologies are not just limited to a select few. Now, there's in how that can be done a variety of sets of challenges and different issues related to that. One of the most common ones is whether we talk about an ethical framework or a more regulatory governance framework. And I think it's important that they are not played off against each other. Ethical frameworks have their place. They're extremely important. They're extremely valuable. But of course, they can't override or prevent governance frameworks from functioning. And indeed, it would be difficult if they would. But if they function in parallel in a useful and sustainable manner, that can be quite effective. And the same is true even if you take a more governance-oriented human rights-based framework. It's very frequent that in these contexts, different human rights are played off against each other. So the right to freedom of expression is seen more important than the right to privacy. The right to privacy is seen more important than the right to free assembly, and so on. And it's very important that in developing standards and frameworks in this context, we always consider all human rights and human rights as a basic foundation for how we think about algorithms and artificial intelligence. Now, if you look at the Charlevoix documents that were developed last summer, you'll also know a considerable focus on human-centric artificial intelligence. And while that's an extremely important design component, I think it's also important to acknowledge that human-centric focuses alone are not enough. And at the same time, that while we're seeing an increasing amount of automated systems, lots of actors who are developing automated systems are not willing to admit how they're actually developing them or what exact elements are part of these systems. It's often joked that some of the most frequent used examples in startups' business plans of artificial intelligence are closer to Mechanical Turk, that's to say human labor, than actual advanced artificial intelligence systems. And it's this human labor that often gets lost on the way or is failed to be acknowledged. And this is also relevant in the context of extra-legal frameworks that are frequently applied when we talk about ethical frameworks, when we talk about frameworks that don't govern in the way the rule of law can. I think we need to be extremely careful there to the extent that which frameworks like this actually come to replace or override the rule of law. And that's specifically also the case where we see lots of conversations right now. I'm sure you will have heard recently about Google's AI board that was recently created and then shut down within the space of just a week or two. And you notice that there's an attempt, on the one hand, a great push to try and be more ethical by some actors, but that this ethical framework is not enough, and the actors realize this by the heavy criticism from this, which again isn't to say that ethics isn't important or ethics isn't necessary, but ethics needs to be done right if it's going to have a meaningful impact on this. And that means that there's a strong role for the public sector as well. We can't allow ethics washing, we can't allow ethics shopping, we can't allow for lowering the bar in the standards that we already have. And as I'm sure you're aware, the existing standards in many areas of public governance, when we're talking about existing norms related to how we govern technology and how we govern the activities of corporations, if you look at the Business and Human Rights framework of the United Nations, for example, are already relatively weak. And in some areas, there's a danger that these ethical principles will even go below existing business and human rights standards. At the same time, to take a more positive note as well, there is an extremely important role for the public sector here. And I think it's again possible to commend the work specifically of Michael Carlin, who's done some fantastic work on algorithmic impact assessments for the Government of Canada. And there's really an important measure to be seen there in how Canada is also taking a lead and really showing what is possible in the context of these algorithmic impact assessments. So I can definitely commend his work there. At the same time, when you look at the recent accusations now that Facebook has been breaking Canadian privacy laws, we have a serious issue related to implementation. And specifically, these breaches that have been of concern to numerous Canadian privacy regulators do raise the question, can we just focus on the public sector alone? And can the public sector alone lead the way? Or do we need to take similar considerations, at very least for large, powerful private sector companies? Because in the world we live in right now, whether you're talking about opening a bank account, whether you're posting something on Facebook, talking to a friend online, even getting a pizza delivery, algorithms and AI are part of every step that takes place in that context. And unless we're willing to limit the agency of these algorithms to things when we consider those things democratically relevant, they increasingly begin to dominate us. And this is not a Terminator-like scenario where we need to be scared that the robots will come and take over the world. It's rather that through these technologies, a lot of power becomes concentrated in the hands of very few human beings. And these are precisely the types of situations where democratic institutions like the parliamentary committee that's hearing on this topic right now were built to deal with, to ensure that the power of the few is spread to the power of the many, and to ensure that having access to AI, the benefits of AI, but also the foundational promise of AI that technology can make people's lives better, both inside Canada and beyond, is accessible to every human being, and that basic human rights provide the core foundation of how we develop and how we think about technologies in the future. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you for that. We'll go next to Mr. Bengio in Montreal. Go ahead, please. 10 minutes.
Hello. So my expertise is in computer science. I've been a pioneer of deep learning, which is the area that has really changed AI from something that was happening in universities into something that's now taking a big economic role and where there's billions of investments in industry. Now, in spite of the progress that's remarkable, I must say that it's also important to realize that the current AI systems are very far from human-level AI, that they're in many ways weak. They don't understand the human context, of course. They don't understand moral values. They don't understand much, really, but they can be very good at a particular task. And that can be very economically useful, but we have to be aware of these limitations. For example, if we consider the application of these tools in the military, when a system is going to take a decision to kill a person and doesn't have the sort of moral context that a human can have to maybe not obey the order, there's a red line which the UN Secretary General has talked about that we shouldn't be crossing. And so going back to AI and Canada's role, the thing that's interesting is we've played a very important role in the development of the recent science of AI. and clearly we're recognized as a scientific leader. We also are playing a growing role on the economic side. Of course, Canada is still a dwarf in comparison to Silicon Valley, but there is a very rapid growth of our tech industry regarding AI. And we have a chance, because of our strength scientifically, to become not just a consumer of AI, but also a producer of AI, which means Canadian companies are getting involved. And that's important to keep in mind as well. Now, the thing that's important, in addition to the scientific leadership and our growing economic leadership regarding to AI, is also moral leadership. And Canada has a chance to play a crucial role in the world here. We have already been remarked for this. In particular, I want to mention the Montreal Declaration for Responsible Development of AI, to which I contributed, which is really about ethical principles. So there are 10 principles that have been articulated with a number of sub-principles for each. Now, this interesting and different from other efforts at trying to formalize a bit the ethical and social aspects of AI, because in addition to bring in experts in AI, of course, there were scholars in the social and humanities, social sciences and humanities, but also ordinary people had a chance to feedback, and actually the declaration was modified thanks to that feedback with citizens in libraries, for example, doing workshops where they could discuss the issues that were presented in the declaration. So in general, I think for the future, it's a good thing to keep in mind that we have to keep ordinary people in the loop. We have to educate them so that they understand the issues, because there will be decisions that we will take collectively that it's important that ordinary people understand. And when I give talks about AI, often the biggest concerns I hear are about the effect of AI on automation and jobs. Clearly, this is something that governments need to think about, and that thinking must be done quite a bit ahead of the changes that are coming. If you think about, say, changing the education system to adapt to a new wave of people who might lose their job in the next decade, those changes can take years and can take a decade to have really an impact. So it's important to start these things early. Same thing if we decide to change our social safety net to adapt to these potential rapid changes in the job market. So these things should be really tackled fairly soon. Another example of short-term concerns. I talked about military applications. It could be really good if Canada played more of a leadership role in the discussions that are currently taking place around the UN. In terms of the military use of AI and the so-called killer drones, which can be used thanks to computer vision to recognize people and target them. So there's already a large coalition of countries that are expressing concern and working on drafting international ban, even if not all the countries, or even if major countries like the US and China or Russia don't go with such an international treaty. I think that Canada can play an important role. A good example is what we did in the 90s with the anti-personnel mines and the treaty that was signed in Canada that really had an impact. Even though countries like the US didn't sign it, the social stigma that came associated with it with these anti-personnel mines, thanks to the ban, has meant that companies gradually have stopped building them. Another area of concern from an ethical point of view has to do with bias and discrimination, something that is very important in Canadian values. And I think it's also an area where governments can step in to make sure there's a level playing field between companies. So companies right now can choose to use one approach or no approach at all to try to tackle the potential issues of bias and discrimination in the use of AI, which comes from the data mostly that those systems are trained on. But there will be a trade-off between their use of these techniques and say profitability or the predictability of the systems. So if there is no regulation, what's going to happen is the more ethical companies are going to lose market share against the companies that don't have as high standards. And of course, it's important to make sure that all those companies play at the same level. Another example that's interesting is the use of AI, not necessarily in Canada, but in other countries. These systems can be used to track where people are, again, using these cameras all over the place. So the surveillance systems are currently being sold, for example, by China to some authoritarian countries, and we're probably going to see more of that in the future. So it's something that is ethically questionable, and we need to decide if we want to just not think about it or have some sort of regulation to make sure that these potentially unethical uses are not something that our companies are going to be doing. Another area that's interesting to think about for government is advertising. So as AI becomes gradually more powerful, it can influence people's minds more efficiently, and using information that a company has on a particular user, a particular person, the advertising can be targeted in a way that can have much more influence on our decisions than older forms of advertising. And if you think about things like political advertising, this could be a real issue, but even in other areas where that type of advertising can influence our behavior in ways that are not good for us, say with respect to our health, for example, we have to be careful. Finally, related again to targeted advertising is the use of AI in social networks. We've seen the issues with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, but I think there's a more general issue about how governments should set the rules of the game to minimize these kinds of influencing, again, using targeted messages, not necessarily advertising, but equivalently somebody is paying for influencing people's minds in a way that might not agree with what they really think or what's in their best interest. Related to social networks is the question of data. A lot of the data that is being used by companies like Google and Facebook, of course, come from users. And right now, users sign consent to allow those companies to do whatever they want, basically, with those data. And there is no real potential strength for bargaining between a single user and those companies. So various organizations, in particular in the UK, have been thinking about ways to bring back some sort of balance between the power of these large companies and the users who are providing data. So there's a notion of data trust, which I encourage the Canadian government to consider as an approach, a legal approach, to try to make sure that the users can aggregate in a sort of, you can think of as like a union, where they can negotiate contracts that are aligned with their values and interests.
Thank you.
So
yeah.
That's it.
Perfect. We'll get to questions. I just wanted to recognize we have a special guest with us today in his class, Professor Michael Geist. Just thank you for attending. And we already talked, you could probably appear at the same panel with us today, but you just going to take the easy road today and just listen in. So again, welcome. Welcome, students, as well. Sorry, can you?
Students from the University of Haifa.
Of Haifa. So we have students from across the water. So
That's east of St. John's, I believe.
just a little. Yeah, thank you for coming
yeah.
today. So we'll start off with Mr. Erskine-Smith for 7 minutes.
Thanks very much. So I want to talk more about regulation than ethics, particularly because when we look at the most recent example where Facebook has said to our privacy commissioner, thanks for your recommendations, we're not going to follow them. And so I think we need stronger rules as far as they go. Mr. Wagner, in a recent article, you specifically, in one of the three examples you use about AI, one is social media content moderation. And at this committee, we've talked about algorithmic sort of transparency. In the EU, obviously, it's algorithmic accountability or explainability. And in that article, you noted that it's unclear what that looks like. And I think it's a new idea, obviously, in the sense that when we've spoken to the UK Information Commissioner and in recent conversations with the EU Data Protection Supervisor, they are just scaling up their capacity to address this issue and to understand what this looks like. Having looked at this issue yourself and written about this, when we talk about algorithmic transparency, is there a practical understanding that we ought to have that it's one thing to make a recommendation on algorithmic transparency? What should it specifically look like?
Just hold on. We don't have. Yeah, I think you're on, Mr. Wagner.
Does this work now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it's an extremely good question. I think at this point there's quite a lot of proposals out there on what it could be. But I think the first thing to come straight to the point is that transparency or explainability itself is insufficient. So just saying we can explain what it does and therefore it's enough is not enough. You have to have someone who's in a meaningful way accountable for the actions of these things, and you need a governance framework around it. So when we're talking about, especially in the context of social media, having a framework for how content is moderated, that also means appeal mechanisms, that also means transparency mechanisms, that also means ensuring that there is some kind of external adjudication if there is a disagreement in these contexts. And then to add an extra layer of complexity when we're talking about sort of regulatory responses to this, there is a challenge that once AI-type systems or automated systems have been embedded within organizations, over time those organizations become dependent on those systems, and it's very difficult to move beyond them or get out of them. So you need to be quite strong on the governance quite early to make sure that you're really having a strong and meaningful effect.
So I want to get to what more it could be. With respect to explainability and transparency, you mentioned Carlin here in Canada and your reference to what the Treasury Board has done with respect to algorithmic impact assessments on the public sector side. It occurs to me that if we are serious about that level of transparency and explainability, it could mean a requirement for algorithmic impact assessments in the private sector akin to an SEC filing where non-compliance would come with some sanctions if information is not included. Is that, do you think, the level at which we should aim for?
Yes, I think in principle that's exactly where things should be going. And I think that's exactly the type of proposal that I was trying to suggest where things should be moving in. What I would add is that, of course, by doing so, you don't want to stifle innovation. So you would need some kind of threshold on top of which, let's say, I don't know, for publicly traded companies or for companies of a certain size, a certain impact. Now, of course, depending on the amount of data those companies hold, those can also be very small companies. So you would have to have different types of thresholds for different types of organizations. But yes, I think that would be extremely helpful.
And Mr. Bengio, you talked about bias, discrimination. You talked about advertising, the ability to influence more efficiently, and the use of AI and social networks. And each time, I think you were hinting at something. I mean, you explicitly, with respect to bias and discrimination, hinted at the need for regulation, or suggested the need for regulation.
Yes.
If it's not just an ethical framework, and I appreciate the work you've done with the Montreal Declaration on ethics, but if we're talking regulation, is there something you would point this committee to say, here's how you ought to regulate algorithmic decision-making and solve some of these problems that you've identified?
Yes. I'm not a legal expert, so there might be different ways that one could regulate. And maybe even in some cases, current laws are sufficient and they need to pass the test of courts. But in the case, let me give you an example in the case of bias and discrimination. So let's say you consider the insurance industry, and you probably would need different regulations for different industries where the issues, the way that they come up might be different. So in the case of insurance, there could be information in the that is used by the companies that could lead to, say, gender discrimination. even though the variables used by the insurance company do not explicitly mention gender or do not explicitly mention race, but it might be something that the AI system infers implicitly. For example, if you live in some neighborhood, maybe it's a good indication of your race in some places, right? And so the good news is that there exist algorithms which can mitigate this, but there will be a trade-off between sort of eliminating the implicit information about gender and the accuracy of the predictions made by those systems. And those predictions turn into dollars, right? So for an insurance company, if I can make a very precise assessment of your risk, like how many dollars are you going to cost me, this is going to be how I'm going to determine your premium, that precision is really worth money. And so there's going to be a pressure from companies to use as much information as they can from their customers, but it might go against our legal principles, and we need to make sure we find the right trade-off.
I guess, I want to pick up there because I think it gets at, we have existing rules from a human rights perspective, and in a way, and why transparency becomes the first step is because it's so hard to enforce any of these rules until a human rights commissioner can adequately assess what is going on. When we were asking questions of the Information Commissioner in the UK in November, her view was, my job is to make it explainable, and then other regulators with other rules and perspectives and rights and values that they want to enforce, it's their job to then do. It's then their job to take on their rules. Is that the sense that you get? Is that the right
so
approach?
That's a first step. We need to have clarity on how these processes that are being put in place in companies, like in an insurance company, that use data to take decisions about people. We need to have some sort of access to that. It's understandable that they might want some secrecy, but government officials should be able to look into how they do it and make sure that it agrees with some of these principles we put in laws, regulations, or whatever. It doesn't mean that the system needs to explain every decision in detail, because that's probably not reasonable. But what's really important is that they document, for example, what kind of data was used, where it came from, the way that the data was used to train the system, under what objective it was trained, so that an expert could look at this and say, well, this looks fine, or there's a potential issue of bias and discrimination, so maybe you should run such and such tests to verify that there isn't. And if there is, then you should use one of the state-of-the-art techniques that can be used to mitigate the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll go on next to Mr. Kent for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks to both of you for appearing before committee today. Professor Bengio, you're to be congratulated for the work that you did on the Montreal Declaration for Responsible Development of Artificial Intelligence. But as this committee has learned, and the public is, I hope, increasingly aware, much of the development of artificial intelligence has been funded by the dataopolies, by the Facebooks, by the Googles, and by the increasing notoriety as we learn of their disregard for written and unwritten ethical guidelines and, in fact, laws. So I'm wondering, just in passing, and you may not be aware, when this committee visited Facebook's headquarters in Washington last year, we were told almost in a throwaway passing comment that we should remember, when we asked about would the company accept increased regulation in Canada, and we were told, well, the sort of investment we made in the AI hub in Montreal might not continue to be forthcoming, which hit me like a clunker. It was basically a threat from a dataopoly that Canada would be ostracized in terms of AI investment should we increase regulation, even along the lines of the GDPR or elements of the EU's GDPR. I'm just wondering, and the question to both of you, should these large companies which are already using and exploiting artificial intelligence in a variety of very commendable ways, wonderful ways, there are benefits, but also in any number of ways which disregard ethical and legal guidelines? Should they be responsible for the misuse or the abuse of AI that occurs on their platforms?
Okay, so let me go to your first question about the Facebook investment in Montreal. Actually, our research centers are mostly funded by government right now. So Mila in Montreal, Vector in Toronto, and AMI in Edmonton that are doing AI research. The vast majority of their funding is coming from governments, provincial and federal. And the investment that was made, say, by Facebook to create a lab in Montreal or to be a sponsor of organizations like Mila are pretty small in comparison to the other investments that are happening. So I wouldn't take this as, I'm not really concerned. The reason that Facebook and other organizations have opened shop here is because they see their interest in it. It makes it easier for them to recruit people which they need for their research groups.
Don't see a threat or any possibility of partnerships exposing the AI that's being developed across the hub, across the various partners to the hub, improperly by these very large companies?
No, so here they're doing a bit of research, and it's a small part of the bigger pie of research they are doing worldwide, which is somewhat disconnected from their actual business. So unless they actually want to try to use threats in a, I think, inappropriate way, that would be really at their disadvantage to pull out of Canada right now.
Okay.
And the other thing is the investment they made and these other companies is still pretty small compared to the magnitude of the impact that we're talking about for all Canadians. So of course we would be sad to see them go, and I don't think they would go. But I don't think we should even pay attention to this kind of statement.
Okay, Professor Wagner.
So I think these threats of this kind are quite indicative of sort of a general regulatory challenge, which is that every country wants to be the leading country on AI right now. And that doesn't always lead to the best regulatory climate for the citizens of those countries. So there seems to have been some kind of agreement between the government of the Netherlands and the automobile industry, who are developing AI-oriented self-driving cars, to not look so closely when they build a factory there, in order to ensure that as a result of that building a factory, they will bring jobs and investment to these countries. And I think that the impact of AI and these technologies will be sufficiently transformative that while these large US giants seem quite important right now, that may not be the case in a few years' time. And I think that a lot of the time the danger is actually the other way around. The public sector has historically invested a lot more than many people are aware of. And a lot of the fortunes of these large, well-known companies are based on that. But of course, in political terms, it always looks more attractive to have Google, to have Facebook, to have Tesla as part of your local industries, because this also sends a political message. And I sense that this is part of the challenge that has led regulators down a path where we have real regulatory gaps, where I would also caution from just expecting information commissioners or privacy regulators alone to be able to respond to this. It's also media regulators. It's also people responsible for elections. It's also people responsible for ensuring that on a day-to-day basis competition functions. All of these regulators are heavily challenged by new digital technologies, and we would be wise as societies to take a step back and make sure that they're really able to do their job as regulators, that they have access to all of the relevant data, and that we may still find that there are then still regulatory gaps where we need possibly even additional regulatory authorities. And there, I think the danger is just to say, we just want progress, we just want innovation. And if you do that a few times and keep allowing that to be a possibility, it doesn't mean that you have to say no to people like Facebook or like Google if they want to invest in your country. But if you start getting threats like this, I would see them exactly as what they are, as like a futile attempt to resist the change that is already coming.
20 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'll save for question for next round.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, we have Mr. Angus for 7 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. You're raising some very, I think, disturbing broad questions that are so much beyond the scope of our committee and what we do. And what we do as politicians, my day job is to get Mrs. O'Grady's hydro turned back on, her electricity. That's what keeps me elected. And yet, when we're talking with AI with you, we're talking about the potential of mass dislocation of employment. What would that mean for society? We have not even had conversations around the human rights impacts, particularly exporting AI to authoritarian regimes, and what that would mean. Then for me, trying to understand it is the rights of citizens and personal autonomy. I mean, the argument that we were sold, and I was a digital idealist at one point, was, we would have self-regulation on the internet, and that would give consumers choice, and people would make their decisions, and they'd click the apps that they like. But when we're dealing with AI, you have no ability as a citizen to challenge a decision that's been made because it's been made by the algorithm. And whether or not we need to actually look at having regulation in place to protect the rights of citizens. Mr. Wagner, you wrote about ethics as an escape from regulation, from ethics washing to ethics shopping. So how do you see this issue?
So as I think, or I'm sure you guessed from the title that you mentioned, I do see that the rise of ethics, and I explicitly wouldn't include the Montreal Declaration in this because I don't think it's a good example of it. But there are certainly many cases of ethical frameworks which just provide no clear institutional framework beyond it. And so a lot of my work has been focused on getting people to essentially either do human rights and governance, or if they will do ethics, then to take ethics seriously, and to really ensure that the ethical frameworks developed as a result of that are rigorous and robust. At the end of the article, you mentioned that there's like literally a framework of criteria of how to go through this, from external participation, external oversight, transparent decision-making, non-arbitrary list of standards. Ethics don't substitute fundamental rights. But to come back to your example that you mentioned on self-regulation on the internet and how we all assumed that that would be the path that we would safeguard citizens' autonomy, I think that's been one of the key challenges where this argument has been misused so much by private companies to then say, for example, well, we have 1 million likes and you only have 500,000 votes. Surely our likes are worth as much as your votes. And I don't even need to explain that in great detail, but just the sort of this logic of lots of clicks and lots of likes surely can be seen as the same thing as votes. And this, in the context of a democratic context, is extremely difficult. Lastly, you specifically mentioned the exporting AI to authoritarian regimes. And I think that there's a strong link between the debates that we have about exporting AI to authoritarian regimes and how we trade in and export surveillance technologies. There are lots of technologies that are extremely powerful that are getting into the wrong hands right now. And limiting that or ensuring through agreements like the Wassenaar Arrangement and other, essentially ensuring that there's a dual use control for certain types of technology will become increasingly important. We have existing mechanisms, we have existing frameworks to do this, but unless we're willing to implement those and sometimes also say, we will do it collectively as a group, even if this means having slightly less, and I emphasize slightly less, economic growth as a result of this, but we can still also say we're taking moral leadership on this issue. It's going to be very difficult to see where these short-term economic gains are going to meaningfully provide for a human rights environment that we would want to stand behind in the years and decades to come.
Thank you. Well, I'm a music buff, and every morning I wake up and YouTube has selected music for me, and their algorithms are pretty good, and I watch them. I'm also a World War II buff, and YouTube offers me all kinds of documentaries, and I see some of these documentaries are on the great historian David Irving, who's actually a notorious Holocaust denier, and they come up in my feed. Now, I got white hair. I know what David Irving is, but if I'm a high school student, I don't. And that's just you know, it's got a lot of likes because a lot of extremists are promoting it. The algorithm is pushing us towards seeing content that otherwise would be illegal. So in terms of self-regulation, I look at what we have in Canada. In Canada, we have broadcast standards for media. That doesn't mean we don't have all manner of debate and crazy commentary and people are free to do it. But if someone was on radio or television promoting a Holocaust denier, there would be consequences. When it's YouTube, we don't even have a proper vehicle to hold them to account. So again, in terms of the algorithms pushing us towards extremist content, do you believe that we should have some of the same kind of legal obligations that are for regular broadcast media? You're broadcasting this, you have an obligation, you have to deal with this.
So I think there is a distinction to be made between online platforms and media platforms. I think there is a substantive difference. And I don't think it's always helpful to just focus on the content. In a lot of these cases, the solutions to this tend to be more procedural and tend to be more, let's say, organizational. So if you have ways in which consumers have more control over the algorithms that YouTube is using to present them with music or to present them with information, that can already deal with a large part of the problem. And that's not to say that there isn't a responsibility with these large organizations. For sure it is. It's just also the great danger that when too much government regulation decides what you can and cannot see on the internet, that's not always
about
so
illegal
much better than when
content.
too much.
But illegal content.
Oh, sure. If it's illegal in that specific jurisdiction, then definitely there needs to be steps to be taken to ensure that. But a lot of the time, at least in my experience of looking at content moderation, it's not so much about legal or illegal. It's more content that creates a certain atmosphere, where then the challenge is that that certain atmosphere chills speech, makes, let's say, minorities, different genders, different people with different sexual orientations much less comfortable speaking, and that impoverishes the public sphere. And we live in a world right now where there is a real challenge that people no longer feel comfortable debating things on the internet who are important parts of our communities. I don't think just saying it's identical to media will fix that problem, but there's a huge challenge on how to restore a space where people genuinely feel comfortable having a public conversation. I think that's a huge challenge, but an extremely important one.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Saini.
Good afternoon to both of you gentlemen. Mr. Bengio, I'd like to start with you first because I would like to ask a question, a technical question, just so I have a better understanding of how algorithms work. I'm sure you're aware of the term the black box problem. Can you explain that? Because to me, that sounds like you have an algorithm, the data is not very good, the algorithm produces a result, and we just take it for granted that that's the result without having any human eyes or any human interaction. So can you just sort of explain that a little bit more for me?
Sure. Actually, we know a lot of things about how that result is obtained. We know that it's obtained as a consequence of optimizing some objective. So, for example, minimizing the prediction error on the large data set. And that tells us a lot about what the system is trying to achieve. And when the system is designed, we can also measure how well it achieves how many errors it does in average on new cases. So there are many other things you could do to analyze those systems before they are even put in the hands of users. So it's not really a black box. The reason people call it a black box, in fact, it's very easy to look into it. The problem is those systems are very complex and they're not completely just designed by humans. The humans design how they learn, but what they learn and detail is something that they come up by themselves. Those systems learn how to find solutions to problems. So we can look at how they learn, but what they learn is something that takes much more effort to figure out. You can look at all of the numbers that are being computed. There's nothing hidden. It's not black. It's just very complex. So it's not a black box. It's a complex box. Now, there are things we can do very easily. For example, once the system is trained and we look at a particular case where it's taking a decision, it's very easy to find out which of the variables that it takes as input were most relevant and how they influence the answer. So there are things that can be said to highlight to give a little bit of explanation about their decisions.
Thank you. Just, Mr. Wagner, I wanted to ask you a question about a term that you used in a recent paper you wrote. You talked about quasi-automation and about keeping humans in the loop. Can you explain that a little bit more clearly to us? Because you talked about 3 places where you felt human agency or the involvement of human agency in decision-making was debatable. You talked about self-driving cars. You talked about border searches on passenger name records. You also talked about social content media. So if you can just expand that term for us so we have a better understanding of what you meant. Can you hear?
Here, could you hear that question? I guess not. Can we just double check that? Are you able to hear us? Are you able to hear me now, either one?
I'm hearing fine.
Mr. Wagner?
Take that as a no.
Yeah, I take that as a no. Can we just double check on the feed there, Mr. Clerk? What's that?
Isn't that how it used to work?
Your
Man,
time's
analog
still-
was so
your
much
time's
better.
still ticking too, Mr.
Analog.
Sandy, so. Yeah, hopefully get it back.
Should I go to...
Your time is up.
Tracks.
It's the deep questions that I
I
have.
know.
Mr. Wagner, are you able to hear us now?
I'll go to my... How much time do I have left?
No, we'll make sure you have 4 minutes, so, yeah.
Should we just wildly wave our arms out?
Yeah, here, I think that one is probably the best.
Oh, there you go. Can you hear me?
They're working on it. Yeah, they're having a lot of problem with Mr. Wagner's because it's browser-based.
Okay. Yeah, no, we'll just wait, yeah.
Because, you know, they told me sometimes on their software, it showed him as...
Mr. Wagner, are you able to hear us again? Mr. Wagner, are you able to hear us now? Mr. Wagner, let us know if you can hear us now. Wagner, can you hear us now? I don't want to, Mr. Saini, you have a question for our witness, so I want to make sure that you get that to the
Yeah,
witness.
just, Mr. Bengio, just one quick question. There's a term I came across called singularity. And I was wondering if you could, like, is it a real thing? And if it is a real, it's not a real, okay, so just if you could explain a little bit, because to me, when I read it, I was alarmed, as you can appreciate.
Yes, that was the intention.
Yeah. So is it a real thing? And if it is,
No.
it's not a real thing. Then why does it keep being written about?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion in many people's understanding of AI. A lot of it comes from the association we make with science fiction. The real AI on the ground is very different from what you see in movies. The singularity is about the theory. It's just a theory that once an AI becomes as smart as humans, then the intelligence of those machines would just take off and become infinitely smarter than us. There's no more reason to believe this theory than, say, some opposite theory that once they reach human level intelligence, it would be difficult to go beyond it because of natural barriers that one can think of. So there's not much scientific support to really say whether something like this is an issue. But there are some people who worry about that, and it's worry about what would happen if machines become so intelligent that they could take over humanity on their own will. Because of the way machines are designed, this is actually today they learn from us, and they are programmed to do the things we ask them to do and that we value. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, this is very unlikely. Now, it's good that there are some researchers who are seriously thinking about how to protect against things like that, but it's a very, I would say, marginal area of research. What I'm much more concerned, and many of my colleagues are, is how machines could be used by humans and misused by humans in ways that could be dangerous for society, for the planet, and that to me is a much bigger concern. The current level of social wisdom may not grow as fast as the power of these technologies as they grow. That's the thing that I'm more concerned about.
Thank you very much.
You have 2 more minutes?
That's okay. Just not enough time. I'll give it to somebody else.
Yeah, okay. Do we have Mr. Wagner back?
I think so, yes, hopefully.
Go ahead, Mr. Saini. Yeah. No. Yeah.
So, Mr. Wagner, before we got cut out, I was quoting a term that you had written in a paper recently called quasi-automation. And you talked about the lack of human agency in certain decision-making processes that was debatable. For example, self-driving cars, border searches, and also social content on the media, and how that can, and I think Dr. Benjo, you've also indicated about fake news and the misuse of AI. So my question is, can you just, because it seems to me that in some cases, human beings are just part of the loop, just for the minimum amount of contact. How do we make sure that there is still the human dimension in making decisions, especially when they come to certain things like fake news and the use of political advertising?
So I think there's a challenge in that if we assume that human intervention alone will fix things, we will also be in a difficult situation because human beings, for all sorts of reasons, often make not the best decisions. I think the thing is that we have many hundreds of years of experience of how to deal with bad human decision-making, and not so much experience in how to deal with mainly automated human decision-making. But the best types of decisions tend to come from a good configuration of the interaction between humans and machines. And this challenge is that if you look at how decisions are made right now, a lot of the time human beings rubber stamp the automated decision made by AI or algorithms. So they'll sort of put a stamp on it and say, great, a human's decided this. When actually a lot of the reason for that is to evade different legal regulation and different human rights principles, which is why we use the term quasi-automation for this, because it seems like it's an automated process, but then you have, let's say, for 3 seconds, for 5 seconds, somebody looking over this. So in the paper that I wrote, and also in the guidelines of the Article 29 Working Party, they've developed guidelines for what they call meaningful human intervention. And only when this intervention is meaningful, so when the human being have enough time to be able to understand the decision they're making, enough training, enough sort of support in being able to do this, only then can it be considered meaningful decision making. And this also means that if you're driving in a self-driving car, you need enough time as an operator to be able to stop, to change, to make decisions. And a lot of the time we're building technical systems where this isn't possible. So if you just look at the recent 2 crashes of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, there's exactly this example where you have an interface between technological systems and human systems where it's unclear how much control the human being has. And even if they do have control, so they can press a big red button and override this automated system, whether that control is actually sufficient to allow them to control the aircraft. And as I understand the current debate about this, that's an open question. And this question that we face now with autopilots and other automated systems in aircraft will increasingly become questions that we have in everyday life. So not just about an aircraft, but also about an insurance system, about how you post online comments, and also how government services are provided. So I think it's extremely important that we get it right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sandy. My apologies for our technical challenges there. Next up for 5 minutes, Monsieur Gourde.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Perhaps Mr. Benjio might be able to answer me in French. Artificial intelligence is finding solutions to our problems, improving services, information, the information we receive. But you did concern me when you said that artificial intelligence system can find solutions to problems by themselves, and if they do, and the problem is us, you talked about killer drones that could commit genocide. If a list is sent to a system of all parliamentarians that have to be eliminated within a given week, that would worry me. Is this pure fiction? Well, some of the things you said are fictions, and some are a cause for concern. We should be concerned about an artificial intelligence system that is programmed, for example, to target parliamentarians in a given country. Scientifically, it's perfectly plausible. It's just a technological issue. Such systems could be set up. And that's why some countries today want to ban systems of that kind. But there should be a distinction made with systems that are not fully autonomous. They simply execute the commands they receive. The system doesn't decide by itself to kill someone. It would have to be programmed to do that. Generally, it's humans who make the decisions on what is good conduct for the system and what is poor conduct for the system. Like you would do with a child, the system learns to imitate what a human would have done. And that is how it finds its own solutions, but on the basis of benchmarks selected by human beings. We've heard a lot of talk about losing jobs and efficiencies. You could have artificial intelligence replacing a foreman, for example. It could make decisions about my production line and do a lot of the production. So will human beings be there only to perform some tasks that are difficult to have performed by robots? AI might even take over transportation. So from 10 to 20 years from now, a great many people will lose their jobs. Is that possible? Yes. The example you're giving is a machine that allocates work, dispatches messages, or couriers are often assigned by artificial intelligence systems. They decide who takes what package where. There's no human contact between the dispatcher and the messenger and the courier. Clearly, as technology advances, there will be an increasing number of jobs automated, but those are the most routine. In the case of dispatching jobs, the most routine part of it was the dispatcher. So that was easiest to automate. The courier's job, the one who actually takes the package to its recipient, is far less easy to automate. What needs to be done is to look ahead and think about measures to minimize the difficulties that human beings will have if so many jobs are lost. From an ethics standpoint, given that the government is gradually instituting artificial intelligence in its service delivery, if I need services from my government, and if I realize that it's an artificial intelligence entity that has provided my answers, if I want a human being to speak to me, to what extent might we be forced by ethics to make sure human beings at the other end of the line? It depends on the service. I'd rather have dealings with an artificial intelligence unit that gives me quick and efficient and correct answers about my tax questions, even if it is a machine. But if I have questions about my health and if it gets personal, and if I am sick and in the hospital, I want to be dealing with a human being. I wouldn't be concerned if the human being with whom I was dealing used AI in his or her job. But there are some interactions where a human being is needed. Thank you.
Mr. Picard.
Merci beaucoup. On a perdu un des.
Thank you. We've lost one of our witnesses. No, there he is.
Hopefully.
Okay, good. Let's try to talk about the positive side of AI. So far, we've been kind of scared of all the issues. Mr. Wagner, you talked about the moral leadership. And to my view, moral is a bit wider than ethics. Ethics are the value that you decide you promote, and then governance will apply them. But moral, there's a society aspect of it where AI is used by individuals, but the system in general are created first by human, and the system must help us govern our values to the point that you suggest moral. Who will do that? Who is credible enough for me to say that, well, that's a wise person, I should count on this type of person or persons to establish what will be from now on my moral guides in my AI systems?
So I think right now we live in a situation where these decisions are overwhelmingly made by private companies, and almost none of these decisions are made by democratically elected governments. And this is a problem for citizens, for rights, for governance. It poses a considerable challenge. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And so whether it's the trade in the technologies where you choose to export them, the development of the technologies, which ones you focus on developing, the research and the research funding for different technologies, what you focus on and what you ensure is developed, I do think there is an opportunity for, I think moral leadership is the right word there, but also to be perfectly blunt, there aren't that many countries in the world that are seriously trying to develop artificial intelligence in a positive way for their citizens and for its development in the context of human rights. There are many which are discussing it and trying, but a lot of the time there's but we're not quite sure, will it have issues for economic development? We're not quite sure, will some of our companies have some mild issues here or there? So I think there is a need to be willing and also have the strength to take that stand. But I do also think that it's important because if there's no countries left in the world which are willing to do that, then we're in a very difficult spot. And I think the Europeans' general data protection regulations have a perspective on what things could be done on data. But for artificial intelligence, for algorithms, we have a whole new set of issues and a whole new set of challenges where I think there will be further leadership required to really get to a human rights basis and a basis that benefits all citizens.
Monsieur Benjo, commentaire sur la question à laquelle je vais ajouter.
Mr. Benjo, your comments on the question? I'll add something to the question, in fact. Do the laws is the legislation that I implement now to protect my privacy, is that legislation going to become counterproductive and prevent me from using artificial intelligence to its full potential? We want to be leaders in a variety of fields, but this is so broad. Where do I begin to establish that leadership? Will that leadership, if it is based on Canadian values, not be as far-reaching? That's a good question, but there's no general answer that I can give, or there isn't one, I should say, in my view. It will take experts who understand the ethical and moral issues and also understand the technological and business issues in every area where these aspects are relevant, to make sure that innovation and protection of the public can go hand in hand. I think that some corporations are simply being defensive. They don't want us to put too many barriers in their way, too many obstacles, but at the same time, I don't know that what's coming is necessarily going to be a problem. There are some areas where we have problems, but there are no easy solutions. For example, we were discussing cases where videos that were illegal were being distributed on Facebook. The problem is that there is no technology today that can detect such videos quickly enough. Facebook is looking into improving its automation systems, and there's simply not enough human beings to monitor every single video posted on the internet quickly enough to prevent it from being posted. That's almost impossible. So either you close the pipe completely, or you wait until you have better technology, or you simply accept the system won't be perfect and human beings will have to press on a button to report something, and that in fact is already done. That's how it's done today.
We're on the list to ask questions, Mr. Kent, Mr. Bayless, and Mr. Angus, but we're at about the 5-minute mark. Because we had so many delays, I would suggest we go into committee business slightly, but it's up to you. What would you like to see? I think the questions still need to be asked, but looking for direction from the committee just to finish the slate of questions. Yes. Yeah. So it'll just push into committee business by about 8 minutes. Okay? Okay, we'll continue on. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Well, thank you, Chair. And in the interest of time, I just got one last question that I'd like to ask to both of our witnesses, and it comes back to this matter of regulation in the borderless digital world. Do you see a need for international treaties which would govern the development and the use of artificial intelligence in ways, I mean, similar to the EU has the GDPR regulations, which is far beyond any regulations which we have certainly in Canada. But would either of you see the need for international, meaningful, enforceable international treaty? And I think the word enforceable is key to this, international treaties to enforce the way artificial intelligence might be used or abused?
I think we have to go in that direction. It's not going to be perfect because there will be countries which don't embark, or some countries might be able to water down the strength of these things. But even some regulation, and in particular here we're talking about international regulation, is better than none by far.
Wagner?
In the experience of what I've seen, people trying to develop general regulation for all of AI or all of algorithms or all of technology, it never ends up being quite appropriate to the task. And so I think I agree with Mr. Bengio in the sense that if we're talking about certain types of international regulation, it would be focused, for example, on, let's say, automated killer systems. And there's already an extensive process going on in this, both in Geneva and in other parts of the world, which I think is extremely important. There's also the consideration that could be made whether Canada wants to become itself a state which has equivalent protections to the GDPR. And that, I think, is also a relevant consideration that would considerably also improve both flows of data and protections of privacy. And I think that all other areas need to be looked at in a sectoral specific way. So if we're talking about elections, for example, often AI and other automated systems will abuse existing weaknesses in regulatory environments. So how can we ensure that, for example, campaign finance laws are improved in specific contexts, but also to ensure that those contexts are improved in a way that they consider automation? When we're talking about the media sector and issues related to that, how can we ensure that our existing laws adapt and reflect AI? I think if we build on what we have already, rather than developing a new cross-sectional rule for all of AI and all of algorithms, we may do a better job. And I think that also goes at the international level, where it's very much a case of building on and developing from what we already have, whether it's related to dual-use controls, whether it's related to media, whether it's related to challenges related to elections. I think there are already existing instruments there, and I think that's more effective than a sort of a one-size-fits-all AI treaty.
Thank you. And just one last remark. Thank you, Professor Bengio, for your explanation, your discussion of similarity. I had the occasion to watch an old version of 2001 and the battle between the human and HAL over the control of the spaceship. And your discounting of the reality of similarity was reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Bayless.
Thank you. Question, is there any country that does presently regulate AI directly? Start with you, Mr. Wagner.
So countries that regulate AI directly as a general thing that I'm aware of right now, no. There are AI-specific regulations in different fields that you will find. For example, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe is one of those cases.
Mr. Benjo, do you know of any that specifically, or are they all subsets of a general regulation?
Yeah, no, I don't think there is. And I would agree with Mr. Wagner that we want sector-specific regulations. And that's also a protection for innovation to make sure that we find the right compromise that makes sense both ethically and technically.
So no one's out there just saying AI in a general sense we're going to regulate. They're doing more what you're suggesting to us, Mr. Wagner, which is to say we already regulate, say, for example, hate speech. Take that one. How is AI going to be regulated within the context of hate speech? Is that the approach that you would both suggest?
Yes.
Is there specific areas that are immediate need? As you're at the forefront of the development of AI, do you see specific areas, like, it's quite a broad thing to go to every one of our regulations and start looking at them and say, okay, we got to make every one of them AI proof. Where would you say we should focus our energies? Where have other jurisdictions focused their energies?
So I mentioned the security and military applications.
I'm sorry, go ahead. We'll start with Mr. Benjo, then go ahead.
I already mentioned the security and the military applications, I think, which deserve more attention. And the reason is we have to act quickly on this to avoid arms race between countries that would lead to the availability of these, say, killer drones. That would mean that it would be very easy for, say, even terrorists to get hold of these things. So that's an example where it would be, there's no reason to wait. The red line has been defined.
Suggestion like the anti-personnel, is that like the anti-personnel mines?
Yes,
Okay.
That's right.
So that's military is one. Mr. Wagner, did you have things?
Sure. So I think the automated drones, or what is termed LAWS, so lethal autonomous weapon systems, is definitely one area where further focus is required. I would also say that what's been mentioned here about the spread, or you could even say the proliferation of certain types of surveillance technologies and AI technologies that can be misused by authoritarian governments is another area where there's an urgent need to look more closely. And then, of course, you have the whole sectors that have been mentioned by this committee already. So media, hate speech related issues, but also issues related to elections. I think here we have a considerable degree of automated technical systems changing a little bit the way the battleground works and how existing debates are taking place. And there's a real need to take a step back, as it was mentioned before and discussed before in the context of AI potentially being able to solve or fix hate speech. I don't think we should expect that any automated system will be able to correctly identify content in a way that would prevent hate speech or that would deal with these issues to create a climate. Instead, I think we need a broad set of tools. And it's precisely this not relying on just humans or just technical solutions, which are fully automated, but instead really developing a wide toolkit of issues that design and create spaces of debate that we can be proud of, rather than just getting stuck in this situation where we say, we have this fancy AI system that will fix it for you.
One of the areas that we hear about, and you mentioned it a few times, transparency. I'm talking about transparency of how an algorithm works, but the transparency of what you're dealing with. So this is a bot or this is a designed as opposed to a human being. And these are AI-driven bots. What are your views on that too? We'll start again with you, Mr. Benjo.
Usually pretty obvious if you're dealing with a machine or a human, because the machines aren't that good at imitating humans. But I think in the future, we should definitely have regulations to clarify that so that a user knows, are they talking to a human or are they talking to a machine?
Mr. Wagner?
I couldn't agree more. And there are also cases, as best as I'm aware, in California, where it's also already being debated to find mechanisms whereby basically automated systems like bots would be required to declare themselves as bots. And I think, especially in the context of elections, but also in other cases, that can be quite helpful. Of course, that doesn't mean that all issues are fixed with that, but it's certainly better than what we have right now.
Thank you, Mr. Bayless. Last up for 3 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you. Mr. Bengio, my riding is bigger than Great Britain, and I live in my car. And my car is very helpful. It tells me when I'm tired. It tells me when I need to take a break. But it's based on roads that don't look like roads in Northern Ontario. So I'm always moving into the center lane to get around potholes, to get around animals, to get away from 18-wheelers. And I start watching this monitor, and sometimes I'm 5 minutes from the house and it's saying I've already exceeded my safety capacity. And I thought, well, you're just bothering me and bugging me, I'll break the glass. And then I read Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism and how all this will be added to, my file at some point. This will be what I'm judged on. And it raises to me the question of the right of the citizen. The right of the citizen has personal autonomy, the right to make decisions. If, as a citizen, I get stopped by the police because I made a mistake, he judges me on that, or she judges me, and I can still take it to have some level of challenge in court if I'm that insistent. That is fair. That's the right of the citizen. But under the systems that are being set up, I have no rights based on what an algorithm that was designed by someone in California thinks what a good roadway is. And so the question is how do we reframe this discussion to talk about the rights of citizens to actually to have accountability so that their personal autonomy can be protected and decisions that are made are not arbitrary, because we have yet to find, when we're dealing with algorithms, a way that we can actually have the adjudication of our rights heard. And so is that the role that you see legislators taking on, a regulatory body? How would we insist that the citizen, in the age of smart cities, surveillance capitalism, that the citizen still has the ability to challenge and to be protected?
Yeah. So it's interesting. This question is related to the issue of the imbalance of power between the user and large companies in the case of how data is used. You have to sign these consents, otherwise you can't be part of, say, Facebook. But it's a similar thing in the way the products are defined, maybe remotely, and we don't, as a user, we don't have access to the details of how this was done. We may disagree on the decisions that are made, and we don't have any recourse. So you're absolutely right. This is something that needs maybe rethinking the balance of power between users and companies that are delivering those products. And so long as the market does its job of providing enough competition between comparable products, then at least there's a chance for things to be okay. But unfortunately, we're moving towards a world where there's more and more concentration of these markets are going to be dominated more and more by just one or a few players, which means that the users don't have a choice. So I think we have to rethink things like notions of monopolies, maybe bring them back, and make sure one way or another that we re-equilibrate the power differential between ordinary people and those companies that are building those products.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. I want to thank our witnesses too. I think it's alarming just for you to say that, essentially AI is largely unregulated. We're seeing that with dataopolies as well, and really trying to grasp what we do as regulators to do that, to protect our citizens. And the challenge is before us, and it's certainly not easy, but I think we'll take your advice to say, you said, Mr. Wagner, to start early, and it already feels like we're too late. But we're going to do our best. But I want to thank you for appearing today from Vienna and as well from Montreal. We're going to just suspend just for a few minutes to get our guests out so we can get into committee business. Thank you.